The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists began gathering for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd, a family from America stood near the front, their phones ready to capture every moment of their London vacation. The father, Mark Thompson, wore a bright red baseball cap and carried an oversized camera around his neck. His wife, Sarah, adjusted her sunglasses while their two teenage children scrolled through their social media feeds, occasionally looking up at the impressive palace gates. The atmosphere was buzzing with excitement as visitors from around the world chatted in different languages, all united by their curiosity about British royal traditions. Street vendors nearby sold miniature Union Jack flags and postcards, featuring the Queen's Guard in their iconic red uniforms and tall black bearskin hats. The smell of fresh coffee from a nearby cart mixed with the crisp autumn air, creating the perfect backdrop for what should have been a memorable tourist experience. Guard James Mitchell had been serving at the palace for 3 years. At 26, he took immense pride in his role protecting the monarchy and representing centuries of British military tradition. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his posture remained rigid and disciplined as he stood at his post. The weight of his bearskin hat was familiar now, though it had taken months to get used to when he first joined the regiment. As the crowd grew larger, James noticed the usual mix of respectful tourists and those who seemed to view the guards as living statues rather than active military personnel. He had learned to ignore most distractions during his training, but something about the American family caught his attention. The father was pointing directly at him and making comments to his family that James couldn't quite hear over the general noise of the crowd. The morning air carried the sounds of camera shutters clicking, children asking questions about the guards, and tour guides explaining the history of the ceremony to their groups. James remained focused on his duties, his eyes scanning the crowd for any potential security concerns while maintaining the stoic expression required of his position. He had been briefed on proper protocol countless times: remain silent, stay alert, and only break character if there was a genuine security threat or emergency. Sarah Thompson nudged her husband as she noticed more tourists arriving. "Maybe we should move closer," she suggested, eager to get better photos. Mark nodded and began pushing through the crowd, his family following behind. They positioned themselves just a few feet away from where James stood guard, close enough to see every detail of his uniform and the serious expression on his face. The teenage daughter, Emma, whispered to her brother about how still the guard was standing. "It's like he's not even real," she said, genuinely impressed by James's discipline and training. Her brother Jake was more interested in getting the perfect selfie with the guard in the background, already planning how he would post it on his Instagram account to impress his friends back home. As more tourists gathered, the space around James became increasingly cramped. He could feel the crowd pressing closer, but this was normal for the morning ceremony. What concerned him slightly was the way the American father kept staring at him and making gestures, as if testing to see if he would react. James had dealt with similar situations before. Tourists who seemed to forget that the guards were real people doing an important job, not just colorful decorations for their vacation photos. The palace grounds were immaculately maintained, with perfectly manicured gardens visible through the iron gates. The grandeur of the architecture served as a reminder of the history and tradition that James was part of protecting. Every day, he felt the weight of responsibility that came with wearing the uniform, knowing that he represented not just himself, but the entire British military and the respect due to the royal family. Tour buses continued to arrive, disgorging more visitors eager to witness the famous ceremony. The mixture of languages and accents created a cosmopolitan atmosphere, but James remained focused on his post. He had learned to tune out most of the chatter, but something about Mark Thompson's behavior was beginning to register as different from the typical tourist curiosity. The man seemed to be studying him with an intensity that went beyond normal interest in the ceremony. Mark Thompson's behavior began to escalate as he grew bolder with each passing minute. What started as curious staring had evolved into something more deliberate and testing. He stepped closer to James, pointing his camera directly at the guard's face from just inches away, the flash going off repeatedly despite the bright morning light. Other tourists began to notice the American's increasingly aggressive approach, some stepping back to give him space while others watched with growing discomfort. "Honey," Maybe you should step back a bit, Sarah suggested quietly, sensing that her husband was pushing boundaries that other visitors respected. But Mark was caught up in what he saw as harmless fun, treating the situation like an interactive museum exhibit rather than a serious military posting. He had read online that the guards weren't supposed to react to anything, and he seemed determined to test this claim to its absolute limit. James felt his jaw tighten slightly as the tourist moved even closer, the camera lens now practically touching the brim of his bearskin hat. Years of training had prepared him for distractions, but this level of disrespect was testing his professional composure. He could smell the man's coffee breath and cologne as Mark leaned in, making exaggerated faces and gestures as if trying to provoke any kind of reaction from the motionless guard. The crowd around them began to thin out as other tourists moved on to better viewing positions for the upcoming ceremony. A few British visitors exchanged disapproving glances, clearly uncomfortable with the Americans' behavior but unsure whether to intervene. An elderly woman from Yorkshire shook her head and muttered something about showing proper respect to her companion. But Mark was too absorbed in his antics to notice the growing disapproval around him. Emma Thompson felt increasingly embarrassed by her father's behavior. At 16, she was already sensitive to social situations, and she could see that other people were starting to stare, not at the guard, but at her family. "Dad, people are watching," she whispered urgently, but Mark waved her off with a dismissive hand gesture. He was enjoying being the center of attention, mistaking the crowd's discomfort for admiration of his boldness. James's training had covered numerous scenarios, from actual security threats to unruly tourists, but the current situation fell into a gray area that required careful judgment. The man wasn't technically doing anything illegal. He was staying on the public side of the barriers and not making physical contact. However, his behavior was clearly designed to test the limits of what a guard would tolerate, and James could feel his patience wearing thin. The palace security cameras were undoubtedly recording everything, and James knew that his response would be scrutinized later by his superiors. Any break in protocol would need to be justified, but allowing himself to be deliberately humiliated could also be seen as a failure to maintain the dignity of his position. The weight of these considerations added to his growing frustration as Mark continued his inappropriate behavior. Other tourists began pulling out their own phones, but instead of photographing the guard, they were recording Mark's antics. Some seemed amused by the spectacle, while others appeared genuinely offended by what they saw as disrespectful behavior toward a member of the military. The atmosphere in the immediate area had shifted from the usual reverent curiosity to something more uncomfortable and tense. Mark decided to escalate further, pulling out his phone to record a video while simultaneously taking photos with his camera. "This guy is like a robot," he announced loudly to anyone within earshot. "Watch this. I bet he won't even blink if I do this." He began waving his hands just inches from James's face, creating a spectacle that was drawing attention from guards and officials stationed throughout the palace grounds. Sarah Thompson grabbed her husband's arm gently. "Mark, please, you're making a scene," she pleaded, her cheeks reddening with embarrassment. She could see that their children were mortified, and she was beginning to realize that what her husband thought was harmless fun was actually quite inappropriate. The looks from other tourists were making her increasingly uncomfortable, and she wished they could just enjoy the ceremony like normal visitors. James could feel a bead of sweat forming under his heavy uniform despite the cool morning air. The combination of the physical demands of standing perfectly still and the mental stress of dealing with the disrespectful tourist was beginning to take its toll. His muscles ached from maintaining his rigid posture, but he knew that any visible sign of discomfort would only encourage more inappropriate behavior from the man who was clearly testing his limits. The sound of approaching footsteps indicated that the changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin, which meant James would soon be relieved of his post. However, Mark seemed oblivious to the ceremonial preparations happening around him, too focused on his one-sided game with the stoic guard to notice the other military personnel moving into position for the traditional ceremony that drew thousands of visitors to the palace every day. The situation reached its tipping point when Mark Thompson decided to make physical contact. Emboldened by what he interpreted as the guard's complete passivity, he reached out and actually touched the brass button on James's red tunic, treating the uniformed soldier like a museum display. The moment his finger made contact with the guard's uniform, something shifted dramatically in the atmosphere around them. James felt the inappropriate touch like an electric shock through his entire body. Years of rigorous military training had conditioned him to respond to physical contact as a potential threat, and the tourist's action crossed a clear line from annoying behavior into actual interference with a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. The touch was brief, but it represented a level of disrespect that could not be ignored under any circumstances. Several nearby tourists gasped audibly when they saw Mark actually touch the guard's uniform. An elderly gentleman from Scotland stepped forward, his face red with indignation. "That's quite enough, mate," he said firmly to Mark, his accent thick with disapproval. "These men are serving soldiers, not your personal entertainment." But Mark barely acknowledged the intervention, still caught up in his game and apparently unaware of how seriously he had just escalated the situation. The other guards stationed around the palace perimeter had noticed the commotion and were already beginning to move closer to James's position. Protocol dictated specific responses to different types of interference, and physical contact with a guard's uniform constituted a clear breach that required immediate action. The backup guards moved with practiced precision, their own training kicking in as they assessed the developing situation. James could feel his heart rate increasing as adrenaline began to course through his system. The months of preparation for exactly this type of scenario were about to be put to the test. He knew that his next actions would be recorded, analyzed, and potentially broadcast around the world, but his primary concern was maintaining the security and dignity of his post while following proper military protocol. Mark seemed completely oblivious to the gravity of what he had just done. Instead of stepping back after touching the guard's uniform, he actually moved closer, apparently encouraged by what he saw as confirmation that the guards truly wouldn't react to anything. He pulled out his phone again, this time holding it up for a selfie with James directly behind him, his face beaming with satisfaction at what he considered his successful provocation of the motionless soldier. Sarah Thompson finally realized how serious the situation had become when she noticed the other guards moving in their direction. Unlike her husband, she could read the body language of the military personnel and see that something significant was about to happen. "Mark, we need to leave now," she said urgently, grabbing his arm more forcefully this time. But he shrugged her off, still focused on getting the perfect photo opportunity. The crowd around them had grown larger as word spread that something unusual was happening with one of the guards. Tourists from various countries pressed closer, their cameras ready to capture whatever was about to unfold. The atmosphere had shifted from casual sightseeing to the tense anticipation that comes before a significant event, though many in the crowd weren't entirely sure what they were expecting to witness. James made his decision in that moment. The combination of the inappropriate touching, the continued harassment, and the presence of other tourists who were watching to see how British military personnel would respond to such disrespect meant that action was not only justified, but necessary. He took a deep breath, his training taking over as he prepared to implement the appropriate response protocol. The morning air seemed to grow more still as James shifted slightly, the first movement he had made in over an hour. Those closest to him could sense the change immediately. The soldier they had been watching like a statue was about to become very much alive. The weight of his rifle, the precision of his training, and the authority of his position all converged in that moment as he prepared to address the situation that had been building for the past several minutes. Mark was completely unprepared for what was about to happen. In his mind, he was just having fun with what he saw as a tourist attraction, completely failing to understand that he was actually harassing a real soldier who had been showing remarkable restraint. His family watched with growing anxiety as they began to realize that their father's behavior was about to have consequences that none of them had anticipated. The sounds of the approaching ceremony, marching feet, shouted commands, and military music provided a dramatic backdrop as the confrontation reached its critical moment. Other tourists continued to arrive for the daily spectacle, unaware that they were about to witness something far more intense than the usual ceremonial changing of the guard that had drawn them to the palace grounds on this otherwise ordinary morning. James Mitchell's voice erupted with the force and authority of 3 years of military training as he shouted the command that would be heard around the world. "Step back from the Queen's Guard." The words thundered across the palace courtyard with such power and precision that every conversation stopped, every camera turned, and every tourist within 50 yards jumped at the sudden transformation of the silent statue into a commanding military presence. The effect on Mark Thompson was immediate and dramatic. The man who had been confidently testing the guard's limits just seconds before now stumbled backward, his face draining of color as he realized he had pushed a real soldier too far. His oversized camera swung wildly around his neck as he nearly lost his balance, and his phone slipped from his suddenly trembling hands, clattering onto the cobblestones below. The crowd's reaction was a mixture of shock, excitement, and satisfaction. Many of the British tourists who had been watching the Americans' disrespectful behavior with growing irritation now nodded approvingly, pleased to see that there were indeed consequences for crossing certain lines. International visitors pulled out their phones frantically, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary that would make for incredible social media content. James took a deliberate step forward, his rifle held at the proper angle, his entire bearing radiating the authority and discipline of the British military. His voice continued to boom across the courtyard as he delivered the next part of his response: "Make way for the Queen's Guard." The command was directed not just at Mark, but at the entire crowd that had pressed too close to his position, and people began moving back immediately, creating a clear space around the guard. Sarah Thompson grabbed her husband's arm and began pulling him away from the confrontation, finally understanding that this was no longer a harmless tourist interaction, but a serious situation that could have real consequences for their family's vacation, and possibly more. "We're leaving right now," she whispered urgently to her children, who were staring at their father with a mixture of embarrassment and disbelief at how quickly the situation had escalated. The other guards, who had been moving closer, now stood ready to support James if the situation required further intervention. Their presence added weight to the confrontation, showing Mark and the watching crowd that this was not just one guard's personal reaction, but a coordinated response from the military unit responsible for palace security. The level of professionalism and coordination was impressive to witness, even for those tourists who might have initially sympathized with Mark's curiosity. Mark tried to stammer out some kind of response or explanation, but his words came out as incoherent mumbling. The confident American tourist who had been treating the guard like a living toy just minutes before was now facing the reality that he had actually been harassing a member of the British Armed Forces. The transformation in his demeanor was complete, from cocky antagonist to chastened individual who suddenly wanted to disappear from the center of attention. James maintained his commanding presence, his eyes locked on Mark while remaining alert to the broader crowd situation. His training had covered de-escalation techniques, but it had also emphasized the importance of establishing clear boundaries when those boundaries had been crossed. The tourist needed to understand not just that his behavior was inappropriate, but that there were real consequences for disrespecting military personnel. The palace security officers who had been monitoring the situation from various positions now began moving closer as well, ready to intervene if the confrontation escalated beyond what the guards could handle themselves. However, it was clear that James's response had been perfectly calibrated, forceful enough to establish authority and end the harassment, but controlled enough to avoid creating a larger incident that might require additional intervention. Emma and Jake Thompson stood frozen in mortification, watching their father receive a very public dressing down from a British soldier, while dozens of tourists recorded the entire encounter. They could already imagine how this video would spread online, potentially following their family for years to come. The vacation photos they had planned to share with friends back home had turned into a viral moment of embarrassment that would be much harder to live down. The crowd continued to watch in fascination as the drama played out. Many had their cameras rolling, understanding that they were witnessing the kind of authentic moment that couldn't be staged or planned. The contrast between the tourist's earlier cockiness and his current deflated state provided a satisfying narrative arc that would make the videos even more compelling when they inevitably appeared on social media platforms around the world. James knew that he had achieved his primary objective. The harassment had stopped, the inappropriate behavior had been addressed, and his authority had been clearly established. However, He also knew that the situation needed to be concluded properly to ensure that it didn't escalate further or create ongoing problems. His next words would be crucial in determining how the confrontation would end and what lessons would be learned by both the immediate participants and the watching crowd. The aftermath of James's commanding shout created a ripple effect throughout the entire palace courtyard. Other tourists who had been exhibiting similar disrespectful behavior immediately stepped back from their positions near various guards, suddenly aware that the silent soldiers were not decorative fixtures, but active military personnel with the authority to enforce proper conduct. The message had been received loud and clear by everyone present. Palace security officers approached the Thompson family with professional courtesy but unmistakable authority. The lead officer, a woman in her 40s with years of experience handling tourist incidents, addressed Mark directly. "Sir, I'm going to need you and your family to move to a different area of the palace grounds," she said firmly. "Your behavior has been inappropriate and disruptive to the ceremony and to our personnel." Mark's face was now completely red with embarrassment and the beginning of anger at being publicly humiliated. He wanted to argue, to defend his actions as harmless fun, but the presence of multiple security officers and the obvious disapproval of the surrounding crowd made it clear that he had no support for his position. His wife continued to pull him away from the confrontation, desperate to avoid any further escalation of the situation. The crowd began to disperse slowly, many visitors now turning their attention to the approaching ceremony, while others lingered to discuss what they had just witnessed. Several tourists approached James with apologetic expressions, offering quiet words of support for his professional handling of a difficult situation. An older British veteran even gave him a subtle nod of approval, recognizing the restraint and discipline the young guard had shown. James gradually returned to his previous position and posture, but the energy around his post remained different. Other tourists now approached with noticeably more respect, keeping an appropriate distance and speaking in hushed tones when taking photographs. The incident had served as an educational moment for everyone present about the proper way to interact with the Queen's Guard during their duties. Sarah Thompson was mortified by her husband's behavior and its consequences. As they were escorted to a different viewing area, she apologized repeatedly to the security officers, explaining that they were visitors from America who hadn't understood the proper protocol. Her genuine embarrassment and respect for the situation helped diffuse some of the tension, and the officers treated the family with professional courtesy, while still making it clear that Mark's behavior had been unacceptable. The Thompson children walked behind their parents in stunned silence, processing what had just happened and how it would affect the rest of their London vacation. Jake realized that his planned Instagram post about the funny interaction with the guard would now have to be completely reconsidered, if posted at all. Emma was already thinking about how she would explain this incident to her friends back home, knowing that videos of their father's public embarrassment were probably already being uploaded to various social media platforms. Within minutes of the confrontation, videos of James's commanding response began appearing on social media. The incident was being shared with captions praising the guard's professionalism and criticizing the tourists' disrespectful behavior. The contrast between Mark's earlier cockiness and his deflated response to the guard's authority made for compelling viewing that resonated with people around the world who had witnessed similar, inappropriate behavior from tourists. James remained focused on his duties as the changing of the guard ceremony began in earnest. The incident had been handled according to his training, and he took satisfaction in knowing that he had protected both his own dignity and that of the institution he represented. The support he received from other tourists and his fellow guards confirmed that his response had been appropriate and necessary under the circumstances. The Palace Press Office began monitoring the social media response to the incident, ready to provide context if needed, but generally pleased with the public reaction. The videos showed British military personnel maintaining high standards of conduct while dealing with inappropriate behavior in a professional manner, which aligned with the image they wanted to project to international visitors and the global audience watching online. Mark Thompson spent the rest of the morning in relative silence, finally beginning to understand the gravity of his actions and their potential consequences. The realization that he had been disrespectful to a member of the military rather than simply interacting with a tourist attraction, was slowly sinking in, and he was starting to feel genuine remorse for his behavior, rather than just embarrassment at being caught. The incident became a talking point among palace staff and guards throughout the day, serving as both a cautionary tale about tourist behavior and an example of how to handle difficult situations with appropriate authority and restraint. James's response would be reviewed and likely used as a training example for other guards facing similar challenges with overly aggressive or disrespectful visitors to the palace grounds. By the afternoon of that same day, the video of James Mitchell's confrontation with the American tourist had spread across multiple social media platforms, accumulating hundreds of thousands of views and generating thousands of comments from people around the world. The footage, captured from multiple angles by various tourists, showed the complete sequence from Mark's inappropriate behavior through James's commanding response, providing viewers with clear context for what had transpired. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive of the guard's actions. Comments poured in from military personnel, veterans, and ordinary citizens praising James's professionalism and restraint in dealing with the disrespectful tourist. Many pointed out that he had shown remarkable patience before finally responding, and that his reaction was perfectly appropriate given the circumstances. The incident sparked broader discussions about proper behavior when visiting cultural and historical sites in foreign countries. Mark Thompson discovered the viral nature of his public humiliation when his phone began buzzing with notifications from friends and family members who had seen the videos online. His brother sent him a text message with a link to the footage accompanied by a simple, "What were you thinking?" His embarrassment deepened as he realized that his inappropriate behavior was now being viewed and judged by millions of people worldwide, many of whom were far less sympathetic to his position than his immediate family. Back at the palace, James completed his duty shift and was debriefed by his commanding officers about the incident. They commended him for his handling of the situation, noting that he had followed protocol precisely and maintained the dignity of his position while effectively dealing with the inappropriate behavior. The incident would be documented in his service record as an example of proper response to civilian interference, potentially benefiting his future career advancement. The viral videos also sparked educational discussions about the role and history of the Queen's Guard. Many viewers who had previously seen the guards as purely ceremonial figures began to understand that they were active military personnel with real responsibilities and authority. Tourism websites and guidebooks began updating their information to emphasize proper etiquette when visiting palace grounds and interacting with ceremonial guards. Sarah Thompson spent much of the day apologizing to her children and trying to process her own feelings about her husband's behavior. She found herself defending him to friends who contacted her about the videos, while simultaneously feeling deeply embarrassed by his actions. The incident forced her to confront the reality that her husband's behavior had been genuinely inappropriate, not just misunderstood or taken out of context as she had initially hoped. International news outlets picked up the story, using it as a springboard for discussions about tourist behavior and cultural respect. The incident was cited as an example of how not to behave when visiting historical sites and monuments in foreign countries. Travel bloggers and cultural commentators used the footage to create educational content about proper etiquette for international tourists, particularly Americans visiting the United Kingdom. James returned to his regular duties the following day, finding that he had become something of a celebrity among both his fellow guards and the tourist community. Visitors to the palace were noticeably more respectful and maintained appropriate distances from all the guards, clearly having learned from the widely shared example of what happens when those boundaries are crossed. The incident had effectively served as a deterrent to similar inappropriate behavior from future tourists. The Thompson family's remaining days in London were subdued, with Mark keeping a much lower profile during their visits to other tourist attractions. He had begun to genuinely understand the inappropriateness of his behavior and felt sincere regret about his actions. The viral nature of the incident served as a harsh but effective lesson about respecting cultural institutions and the people who serve them, regardless of their ceremonial roles. Online discussions about the incident evolved beyond the immediate confrontation to examine broader issues of privilege, respect, and appropriate behavior in different cultural contexts. Many commenters shared their own experiences of witnessing inappropriate tourist behavior, at various historical and cultural sites around the world. Using Mark's example to illustrate the importance of understanding and respecting local customs and traditions, the Palace Tourism Office noted a temporary increase in visitor interest following the viral incident, but more importantly, they observed improved behavior from tourists who were now more aware of the proper protocols for interacting with palace personnel. The incident had inadvertently served as a powerful educational tool, reaching a global audience with lessons about respect and appropriate conduct that traditional guidelines and posted rules had failed to convey effectively. The long-term impact of the incident extended beyond just tourist behavior, inspiring discussions about duty, respect, and professionalism in various fields. James's measured but firm response became a case study in how to handle difficult situations with appropriate authority while maintaining professional standards, relevant for customer service workers, educators, and others who deal with challenging interpersonal situations in their daily work. 6 months after the incident, the changes in tourist behavior at Buckingham Palace were still evident to anyone who worked there regularly. James Mitchell noticed the difference every day during his shifts. Visitors maintained respectful distances, spoke in quieter tones when near the guards, and seemed genuinely interested in learning about the history and significance of the ceremony, rather than treating it as entertainment. The viral video had accomplished what years of posted signs and verbal warnings from tour guides had failed to achieve. Mark Thompson's experience had profoundly affected not just him but his entire family's approach to travel and cultural experiences. Back in their hometown in Ohio, he had become reluctantly famous as that guy who got yelled at by the British Guard, a reputation that followed him in his local community for months. The experience forced him to examine his attitudes toward other cultures and the way he behaved as a representative of his country when traveling abroad. The incident had sparked policy discussions within the British tourism industry about how to better educate international visitors about appropriate behavior at cultural and historical sites. New orientation materials were developed that used the viral video as an example of what not to do, helping to prevent similar confrontations while preserving the dignity of both tourists and the personnel they encountered during their visits. James found that his professional reputation had been enhanced by the incident rather than damaged by it. His superiors praised his restraint and professionalism, and he received commendations from military leadership for his exemplary handling of a challenging situation. The incident was cited in his performance reviews as evidence of his ability to maintain discipline and authority while following proper protocols under pressure. Sarah Thompson had used the experience as a teaching moment with her children about respect, cultural sensitivity, and the consequences of inappropriate behavior. Emma and Jake had initially been mortified by their father's actions, but over time they came to appreciate the lessons learned from the incident. They became more thoughtful travelers, researching local customs and expectations before visiting new places during subsequent family vacations. The viral video continued to circulate online years later, often appearing in compilations of tourist fails and examples of military professionalism. It became a reference point for discussions about appropriate behavior when visiting monuments, museums, and other cultural sites around the world. Travel educators and cultural awareness trainers frequently used the footage to illustrate important points about respect and appropriate conduct in different cultural contexts. Palace officials noted that the incident had actually improved relationships between tourists and guards, as visitors now approached interactions with greater understanding and respect. The guards appreciated being treated as the professional military personnel they were, rather than as living statues, while tourists found that respectful interactions often led to more positive experiences and sometimes even brief, appropriate conversations with the guards during less formal moments. Mark eventually wrote a letter of apology to the palace, acknowledging his inappropriate behavior and expressing genuine regret for his actions. While he never received a direct response, the act of writing the letter helped him process his feelings about the incident and contributed to his personal growth following the embarrassing experience. He became an advocate for respectful travel behavior in his own community, often sharing his story as a cautionary tale. The long-term impact of the incident extended beyond tourism to influence how people thought about respect for public servants, military personnel, and cultural institutions in general. The video was shared in military communities as an example of proper response to civilian interference, while civilian audiences used it to discuss appropriate behavior when interacting with people in uniform or ceremonial roles. James continued his service with the Queen's Guard, eventually being promoted and taking on training responsibilities for new recruits. He used his experience from the viral incident to teach younger guards about handling difficult situations with tourists, emphasizing the importance of maintaining dignity and following protocol while showing appropriate firmness when boundaries were crossed. The incident became part of the folklore surrounding the Queen's Guard, joining countless other stories of memorable encounters between tourists and the famously stoic soldiers. However, unlike many such stories that focused on the Guard's ability to remain motionless despite distractions, this one highlighted their authority and professionalism when that authority was challenged inappropriately. Years later, the Thompson family returned to London for another vacation, this time approaching their visit with much greater cultural awareness and respect. Mark made a point of observing the guards from an appropriate distance, appreciating their discipline and service rather than viewing them as entertainment. The family's experience had transformed from a source of embarrassment into a catalyst for more thoughtful and respectful travel, demonstrating that even viral moments of poor judgment can lead to positive personal growth and better understanding between cultures.